I'm sure many of you have been to Alaska, know about Alaska. It's, it's essentially the last great frontier in North America, right? This is obviously a size to scale interpretation of how big Alaska is. It's about a third the size of the lower continental US. It is twice as big as Texas, my home state, which many Alaskans took joy in telling me when I was up there. And it's essentially 600,000 square miles of pristine wilderness. There is a population of about 700,000 people in Alaska, so you're talking about one person per every square mile, so very low population density. And in addition to that, you're talking about, there's just mind-blowing. I think there's like 40,000 miles of coastline in Alaska, more than all of the continental US combined. There are 37 mountain ranges in Alaska, and this is one that really blows my mind. There are 3 million lakes in Alaska, 20 acres or larger, 3 million lakes, and of course numerous rivers and so forth. So I mean, it's, in terms of habitat and biodiversity, it's a pretty remarkable place. Here's some shots that I took while I was up in Alaska. Now we talk about biodiversity. Alaska would obviously have no problem supporting a population, a substantial population of Sasquatches. You have, of course, everything is fueled by the salmon runs, and you just have amazing salmon runs that when they're spawning and stuff. In addition to that, there's all kinds of things: wild berries, small animals, roots and tubers, conifer pine needles, and things like that. So you have a lot of food sources. And we also have a number of Native American, appropriately, we have a number of Native American legends that refer to Sasquatch-type creatures. Now, if you're familiar with the cultures of Alaska, you have a number of different groups or tribes, but primarily you have the Inuit people who are, essentially live along kind of the far north and some of the coastal areas. A division of that are the Yupik tribe, very prominent in Central Africa. Alaska. You have the Athabascan people, which is a big, kind of north central and eastern Alaska. And then you get down to the coastal areas and you have the Tlingit tribe and also the Haida tribe. All of these groups of people have legends or stories or cultural references to what they call hairy men or bushmen, so on and so forth. And these are some of the names. Arulatak, that is from southwest Alaska and the Kenai Peninsula. That basically means, the interpretation of that is the one who bellows, okay? We have the Gagit. Gilyuk is a Haida name from the Haida tribe on the southeastern coast, and the translation of that is cannibal giant. Hootsland, not as common. The Kushtaka, which I'll talk about, that's a Tlingit word, and the Tlingit tribe live kind of in the area around Sitka and Prince of Wales Island. Kushtaka is, the literal translation of that is land otter man, but many people feel that it might be the Tlingit version of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Nantinak, that is a name from the Kenai Peninsula. Tornit, and Urayuli, and that's from southwest Alaska, mostly Inuit. And most of those names basically interpret to mean hairy man or bushman. And so for the episode on Missing Alaska that we did on Bigfoot in Alaska, we did decide to refer to it as the hairy man. We didn't really use the word Bigfoot much. We figured people would put two and two together and figure out what we were talking about there. Incidentally, this artwork is done by a friend of mine in Alaska, artist, researcher, guy named Rob Roy Menzies. Some of you may be familiar with him, or at least familiar with some of his Bigfoot artwork, which is pretty spectacular. So here's his kind of recreation of Patty. And Rob Roy's a colorful guy. In addition to being an artist, he's also an expert in downed aircraft forensic analysis of airplane crashes, and he's also a musician, and just an all-around kind of interesting guy, very adventurous. Here's another one of Rob's illustrations of the Kushtaka, the land otter man. And the Tlingit legend refers to the Kushtaka as kind of a shapeshifter. Man-like in some respects, upright, covered in hair, but they really do associate it with the otters, which are, there's two species of otters, of course. You have the sea otters and the land otters. The land otters or the river otters are very common in that area. And the official Tlingit legend states that Kushtakas are shapeshifters and that they take the forms of otter or man otters, and they're very crafty and malevolent, and they will actually try to draw people out into the wilderness and by using all sorts of trickery. For example, they may take the form of one of your friends, or they may use a voice that sounds like a baby crying or like somebody in distress to try to lure you out into the wilderness. And once you're out in the wilderness, they will indoctrinate you and transform you into a Kushtaka, so you become part of that clan. So it's the Tlingit people that we talked to up there took this very seriously. They're very, very convinced that the Kushtaka exists. But again, it could, potentially, this could be an interpretation of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch type creature. As you know, and sometimes in legends and folklore, the lines get very blurry, so it's hard to delineate. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the historically famous Bigfoot, Sasquatch accounts and experiences in Alaska, and I'm just going to check my time, make sure I don't babble on too long here. One of the most famous stories in Alaska is the story of the quote-unquote Devils of Thomas Bay. And this is a story that goes back to the year 1900. And there's a famous book in Alaska, a very old book called The Strangest Story Ever Told. It was written by a gentleman named Harry Culp. And after Harry passed away, his daughter found the manuscript and had this book published. But the story talks about how Harry and 3 other prospectors went up to an area called Thomas Bay, known locally as the Bay of Death. The reason it's called the Bay of Death is that allegedly, back in the 1800s, there was a Tlingit village in this bay, and a landslide buried the entire village and killed 500 people, 500 Tlingit people. So the local Tlingit people feel that this is a very evil place. They don't really go up there. It's in southeast Alaska. It's near Petersburg, the town of Petersburg. But Harry Culp and these 3 prospectors had heard there were these great gold mines up here in Thomas Bay. So they decided to go up there and start scouting around for these gold mines in 1900. And one of Harry's prospector friends was a guy named Charlie. And according to Harry Culp, this is obviously secondhand, he was up there on one location at Thomas Bay by himself on a high elevation scouting out the area. And he says that he saw this group of what he called devils swarming up the mountain or the lookout location towards him. And he described them as looking like both man and monkey, but neither. And he described them as very covered in hair, upright, and very swarthy and covered in scabs, and just very scary. And he fought them off with his rifle misfired, and so he fought them off and took off and managed to get to his kayak or canoe and get to safety. And Charlie, of course, never went back to this area. And then subsequent to that, 2 of the other prospectors claimed that they also went up to this area and had an encounter with these creatures. So again, this is a Rob Roy Menzies interpretation of the Devils of Thomas Bay, which I guess they're a little bit smaller than you would think of, kind of maybe 3 to 5 feet tall. And we'll talk about the the dwarfs, the hairy dwarfs, gnomes of Alaska here in a few minutes. So that's a famous story. Okay, and on the right-hand side here, of course, we have Bob Titmus, considered by many to be one of the greatest Bigfoot trackers ever. The guy that gave Jerry Crew the idea to cast the famous footprint that gave us all Bigfoot. Bob Titmus claimed that he had one Bigfoot sighting in his life, which was in 1942 when he was enlisted in the Navy. He was fighting in World War II, and according to Bob, was documented by John Green. According to Bob, he was sailing up the coast of Alaska. It was about 10 o'clock one night during the summer, so the sun was still up, because of course the sun sets very late there at that time of year. And he was out on the deck and he saw a creature on the beach that he described as looking like a big, hairy, ape-like thing, standing about 6 or 7 feet tall. And this was, of course, many years before Bob Titmus had ever heard of Bigfoot or had moved to Northern California. So at the time, he thought it was obviously very strange and unusual, but he didn't, nothing really clicked. But Bob talked about this sighting years later, so that's interesting that Bob Titmus had his one Bigfoot sighting up on Alaska, off the coast of Alaska. And a quick sidebar here also, this is, of course, is Ivan T. Sanderson, very famous, one of the pioneers of cryptozoology, the field that I'm involved in. And Ivan wrote an excellent book called Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, very influential. But Ivan received a correspondence in the 1950s from a gentleman who was stationed on Shemya Island, which is one of the Aleutian Islands, at the very close to Russia, in fact, at the end of that island chain. And according to this gentleman, during World War II, they were building an airstrip on the island of Shemya for the war effort, and they unearthed giant human-like skeletons that were, maybe 7 feet tall. And as is often the case, allegedly, these giant human-like skeletons were shipped off to the Smithsonian Institute and mysteriously vanished. So it's just a story, there's not a lot of corroboration, but some of you who are very interested in kind of the story of giant human-like skeletons, but I just mentioned it in passing. It may not have been a Sasquatch at all, but it's just worth noting that giant human-like skeletons have been found unearthed in Alaska. Maybe it's a Sasquatch, who knows? Okay, so now we're going to talk about one of the most famous